All right, I want to welcome everybody back to the fifth lesson of Black American or African American Studies with me, the Forecast. And of course, I want to thank y'all, for all the support and all the love y'all been showing me because this is a lot of work. So, y'all help me to keep going. So I appreciate y'all. And for anybody who's an expert in any particular field, whether it be any kind of science, physics, chemistry, whatever it may be, finance, business classes, or if you're an expert on, ancient history with our people, I encourage everybody to put together some kind of course or something that we could put together for our children. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to use it or at least use it as a base. But whatever we learn and our children learn, we want them to have the right mindset because it's no point of learning how to do so much stuff and then you give it away to everybody else and you don't benefit off of it. So we want to teach our children and encourage education, but we also want them to have the right mindset. So we should definitely get together and put together some of these courses. Now, last week we touched on a lot of different things. Like we saw the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was essentially one of the first times that Europeans put aside their tribal divisions to come against us, right? And that's something we definitely need to learn to this day, putting aside our tribal differences to protect ourselves. But we saw how the land was divided, especially here in America. You got the French, the Spanish, the British, all competing here in America. And of course, the French created New Orleans and Louisiana in 1718. But we also saw many instances of Black people fighting back because we have to understand that we've been fighting since day one. We've never just accepted anything. It's important to know how much courage and the things our ancestors did to fight for freedom. Now, we also saw a few of those revolts on slave ships, but I know some people deny slave ships even exist at all. Now, they might be saying that for an ulterior motive, and they may only be talking about one specific place, right? But when you start to break it down, it's a little bit more complicated when you ask, did slave ships go to Brazil or something like that? Or even asking, did the French bring in slaves in New Orleans? It gets a little bit confusing because usually when they say that, it's ulterior motives saying that, I'm not going to get into any of that, but it's ulterior motives. And like I said, the problem with that is most slaves were not brought to North America or what became the United States of America. The majority of slaves were transported to the Caribbean and to places like Brazil. Now, between the late 1400s and early 1700s, hundreds of quote-unquote military bases or forts were built along the Gold Coast.
Originally built by Sweden in the 1650s, then shifted to the Danish, then the Dutch, and then became an English possession by the 1660s. In the castle's early decades, trade revolved around gold, wood, and textiles, before English merchants began to seek captive Africans in large numbers.
This is actually the youngest as well as the smallest of the three castles built along the coast of West Africa. But then we say that this is the biggest slave castle. It's the biggest slave castle because it was built at the time when the transatlantic slave trade was at the highest level. So the dungeons here were actually built much bigger to hold about 1,500 people at the same time. Well, the people that were brought here were not all from Ghana. They brought them in from several parts of Africa. But the biggest number came from West Africa. And they had to walk from wherever they were captured, either tied up or in shackles and chains. They find themselves here in Cape Coast Castle in particular. Before they send them into the dungeons, each group of Africans that were here were owned separately by lots of British companies. So the companies will then put metals with their initials on them into fire. A tent where they pull it out. Before the metal goes to any part of the human body, they smear that part up with oil before they brand them. After branding them, they would send them into the dungeons where they stayed at least 2 weeks or 3 months, waiting for the arrival of the slave ships. Now we are in the male dungeon, starting from here all the way down to the 5th room. The whole place took about 1,000 black men. 1,000 black men, mathematically we will say that each of these rooms held about 200 people.
We walk through the door of no return.
Now, Europeans fought each other over these territories for control of these forts. And they essentially used them as makeshift prisons where Africans who have been kidnapped were brutalized until they were put on a ship and sent to whatever colony they were going to. Now, of course, many of you know the details about what was going on to these people in these forts. And, some people don't even believe it, but I don't know where that comes from. But, I'm not going to get into all the specific details, but if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask. We can definitely talk about it. But I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard about the details about what was going on in those slave forts where they were housed until they were shipped off. Now, anybody who showed any signs of having a rebellious side or they thought they were going to fight back, they were kept in small confinement cells, similar to what you would find in prison today when they put somebody in the hole. Now, they called it, especially around Ghana, the door of no return, because once somebody was taken away, they usually never came back. Now, on the ships, of course, you were shackled the same way that you would shackle a prisoner, right? And they even did this to impregnated women. Now, the complicated thing is I do see a lot of cases where the numbers get mixed up, where the official record will say like 100 people or something, but some document will say 400 people. And I know sometimes people take those numbers out of context. And that is where a lot of confusion comes through. But the conditions on those ships were so horrible. Some people tried to kill themselves or throw themselves overboard. Now, for those of you who deny it, think about what it was like and how horrible it was for white sailors in the 1700s with far less technology than we have today. Now, imagine how they treated prisoners, right? Let alone slaves, but imagine how they treat a prisoner. And if you don't think those voyages were horrible, I don't know what to tell you. But yes, some people chose to throw themselves overboard as opposed to be a slave. And some people drowned to avoid being found. Some people couldn't swim at all. And I'm sure you heard in the movie Black Panther, Killmonger say, "Bury me and my ancestors who knew it was better to be dead than in bondage." Right? I'm sure y'all heard of that. But I have heard some people say that during this period of a couple hundred years, that so many people died in these waters that the sharks changed their migration patterns. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, but, I have heard that. Now, those who refused to eat, they were usually threatened with violence or, they faced flat out violence. And they also have this tool that, somebody found that used to punch out your teeth and it helps them force food down your throat. So it'll knock out your front teeth so they can stuff food down your throat. Because there were people who refused to eat in protest. Now, anyone that got sick, really ill or really injured, was usually thrown overboard. But don't get it twisted like they were only killing themselves or protesting by not eating or something like that. These people were actually fighting back. And according to their records, at least 1 out of every 10 ships reported some kind of rebellion or mutiny.
For some backstory, according to a lecture given by Stephen C. Lupkeman in the Transatlantic Slave Database, which tracks slaving ships, there were an estimated 30,000 plus different voyages with a documented 1,008 plus vessels that shipwrecked with slaves on board. However, we have to note this is a massive underrepresentation of the true total number of slaver shipwrecks due to shoddy record keeping, the amount of time that has passed, and the fact that most of these wrecks have yet to be found. There's a fair estimation that there are 3 to 4 times the number of wrecks out there that aren't discovered. With the sinking of slaving vessels, there is a chance for marine archaeologists to connect the dots between hidden transcripts and resistance to slavery. What I mean by this is that it is estimated between 15% and 20% of slaving ships that wrecked sank because of an act of rebellion on board. Although São José Paquete Africa, or the São José for short, is not one of these rumored vessels, there were some discovered prior to 2015 that were suspected to have sunk under these circumstances. That gives us a very interesting, sad perspective on the sinking of slave ships. According to the New York Times, the ship traversed oceans and between multiple continents, from small fishing villages in Africa to Europe and the New World. What we do know is that the ship departed from Lisbon sometime in 1794, going then to the Mozambique Islands on the east coast of Africa and departing from there on December 3rd, 1794. It's known currently as the Lion's Head in Cape Town. They struck this reef right near Cape Town at 2 a.m. on December 27th, 1794, though the ship was not sinking for the time being. The sinking was a slow death, and they were able to affix a line to the shore and haul people off the ship. And by people, I mean the people they deemed worthy of saving, the Portuguese crew and about 280 enslaved people. However, unfortunately, in the slow sinking, 212 would perish with the São José Paquete Africa, and 12 more would die within a week after the disaster. This wreck happened fairly close to the shore. The only way the 280 that did survive managed to get off the sinking ship was because of the line tied to the shore. These people that did survive were sadly sold 2 days after the disaster. We know the information we do from the paraphrased inquiry into the sinking and the testimony of Captain Manuel Joao, which is disturbing. They'd hugged the shoreline to avoid strong winds and heavy seas, but they were too close and struck the reef. The slaves that were saved were only rescued because they were seen as valuable cargo, which is just disgusting and inhumane. According to the testimony, they worked until 5 p.m. when the ship was lost, and 212 slaves were lost to the sea. What is even more disturbing is that the crew were referred to as men, but the slaves couldn't even get that respectful of a distinction. They were property and were treated worse than livestock. For example, one man, referred to only as Black Man in the ship's manifests, was sold and disembarked the vessel on December 22, 1794, leaving to return to Mozambique Island.
In 1729, a slave ship called the Clare reported a mutiny. Now, according to the Boston Newsletter from 1729, the Captain Morrell, said, "These black people," and he didn't say black people, "got control of the gunpowder and some of the weapons, and they were able to take over the ship. Because, if you put all of the gunpowder in one spot, you can actually make a bomb. But according to the captain of the ship, they got control and turned the ship around, crashed it on land within a few leagues, however far a league is, of the shore castle." In another case, an English slave ship captain, William Snellgrave, or however you pronounce his name, wrote about at least 3 mutinies on slave ship from his book in 1734. And his book was called A New Account of Some Parts of Guinea and the Slave Trade, which was published in 1734, so you can read it yourself. Now, in his book, he was trying to tell other slave ship captains that kindness to slaves was probably going to end up in a rebellion, and he was trying to encourage them to treat them as harshly as they could. And he ended up writing about a mutiny on a ship called Fur's Galley, or the Fur Rebellion. And he said the captain was way too kind to the Negroes, and it led to his destruction. Now, he also wrote about 2 other mutinies on slave ships. But, according to them, there are over 485 rebellions on slave ships. And if you try to go through every single one, then we'd be here forever. But we will talk about a few as we get to it. But, they say the French, the Dutch, and the British were the ones who kept the best record, so we have the most information with them. But their numbers include every single instance of disobedience to a flat-out mutiny. It could be one person on the ship just not listening, and they would count that. Or it could be a full-on mutiny where they took over the ship. Now, most of the rebellions, especially the successful ones, happened right on the coast of Africa before they could get anywhere. And they say that 485 number includes 93 attacks by Africans from the shore before the ships could even pull off. And I think that the more that we know about how much we actually fought back and the real aspects of it and the destinations and more information, and we studied it more, there'd be less debate about it. But, like I said, we'll be here forever if we go down the list. But we will touch on a few more in future lessons, especially the major ones. Now, as for the Danish, Denmark got into the slave trade in 1657. And by 1718, they were in control of the St. John Island and the Virgin Islands. Now, these Danish people from Denmark, they were the ones that started referring to the slaves as black gold. And I'm sure you heard the term black gold around like Ghana and stuff like that. Now, before, in the first or second lesson, we did touch on some African tribes who may have had some kind of involvement in the slave trade. But one tribe that we didn't mention that was heavily involved was the Aquamu tribe. Now, they traded with the Danish, who gave them rum and guns in exchange for them to go and attack surrounding tribes and bring them more slaves. And we know in a lot of cases when they say Africans sold other Africans, it's not genuine and there's a lot of circumstances around it. But with the Aquamu tribe, they were known for being harsh towards Africans. They were trying to be like Europeans, but they weren't as savage as them. But they were trying their best. But then in 1730, their king died, and it left them vulnerable because they had been attacking all of the surrounding tribes. And now that they didn't have their leader, they were unable to protect themselves. So then those surrounding tribes were able to capture them, and they sold them to the same Danish people that they were selling their people to. And now the Aquamu people got to see firsthand that loyalty, allegiance, or any of that kind of stuff doesn't mean anything to Europeans. And Europeans were there to make slaves, not friends. Because even though they did business with them at first, once they were captured, they were sent to St. John in the Virgin Islands. And they sent everybody, including the king, prince, noblemen, businessmen, all of them. Now in St. John, slaves outnumbered whites by over 900, and most of the plantation owners lived in St. Thomas, and they hired overseers to run their plantation. And in some cases they were black, and other cases they were black Europeans, if you know what I mean. Now understand that not every form of rebellion is just an outright act of violence or, physical altercation that we can see. Many of the slaves used their knowledge of nature, of plants, basically used herbology to poison and kill the slave owners. Now, most of the time they relied on enslaved women to cook their food, and they would take that opportunity to put poison in their food. And they really couldn't tell the difference because the symptoms were pretty much the same as the diseases they were getting on the island. Often dependent on their ability to make food and their knowledge of plants to heal them, right? But they were actually poisoning them. But it was just too hard for them to detect. Now, whether they died from disease or poison, they usually blamed slaves for everything. So they ended up passing harsher laws. And if anybody was found guilty of poisoning somebody, they received 3 pinches from a red-hot pincer and then were placed on a breaking wheel. And a lot of times they just accuse you without any evidence. But anybody who tried to escape slavery was sentenced to 150 lashes and either their ear or maybe their leg was cut off. If another slave knew somebody was going to try to escape and didn't warn or tell on them, they were burnt on the forehead and got 100 lashes just because they didn't snitch. If a Negro, whether free or enslaved, even attempted to hit a European, they were hung immediately. And even when a slave owner asked for a pardon, they just cut their right hand off. Now, despite all of these laws, it didn't stop the Aquamu people from fighting back and starting their own rebellion.
The Aquamu leaders begin to plan a coordinated campaign of revolution. Meanwhile, others take more immediate action. Their only weapon, a lethal knowledge of nature. The slaves recognize on St. John many of the same plants and herbs that grow in Africa. The evidence supports historical accounts that colonists have begun to rely upon African herbal cures to survive the tropics. But according to Danish records, being at one with nature could prove hazardous to your health. Get on the wrong side of your cook, and you might want to think twice about diving into that turtle soup. By 1733, poisoning is a leading cause of death on St. John. For the victims, it's hard to see it coming. The effects of poisons made from the island's plants create symptoms that resemble those of tropical diseases that run rampant in the Caribbean. Père Labat, a French priest, writes this report.
The secret and insidious manner in which the crime is generally perpetrated make legal proof of it extremely difficult. Suspicions have been frequent, but their detections are rare.
Governor Gardelin puts a brutal new slave code into effect to scare the Africans into submission. 19 cold-blooded paragraphs give plantation owners free rein to inflict inhuman punishments on their field hands and servants.
A slave who attempts to poison his master shall be pinched 3 times with red-hot pincers and then broken on a wheel. Any slave, knowing of the intention of others to run away, shall be burned on the forehead and receive 100 lashes. Each runaway slave shall lose 1 leg, or if the owner pardons him, shall lose 1 ear and receive 150 lashes. A slave who lifts a hand to strike a white person or threatens him with violence shall be hanged. Should the white person demand it, if pardoned, he shall lose his right hand.
Along with other Akwamus, King June and Prince Akashi seize the day. Armed with makeshift weapons and a handful of stolen guns, they plan their revolution. The morning of November 23rd, Prince Akashi and King June select 2 targets. The first is plantation owner Johannes Satman. Some believe the slaves knew he was close to the governor and savagely attacked in revenge for Gardelin's brutal slave code. As the whip changes hands, the brutality of the master now becomes that of the slave. Meanwhile, a few miles away, a group of slaves arrive at the fort with a routine delivery of firewood. Hidden in the bundles are razor-sharp knives. Archaeologists find several of these tools at the Cinnamon Bay site.
This is the cane knife found just off the shore in Cinnamon Bay.
Experts suspect at least one female rebel is motivated by ties of blood and love. Her name is Breford. On the afternoon of the revolt, she joins a raiding party headed here to Brown Bay.
It was here that as the uprising spread from Coral Bay into the countryside, that the planters at Brown Bay were amongst the first to feel the brunt of the rebels' resolve.
The plantation is the scene of a bloodbath. Killed is a colonist named Croyer, his wife and children.
They were not able to afford full-grown, healthy adult slaves, so they had purchased 2 children.
While the deaths are brutal, the motive is universal.
It's quite possible that as the rebellion spread to this area, the Croyers were singled out in an effort to save those children.
Now, the Akwamu tribe saw themselves as wealthy merchants, as nobles, leaders, as royalty, and most importantly, they saw themselves as free people. Now, the issue with them, they thought they were also better than other African tribes or other black people. And they felt like other black people should be their slaves. So they made a plan amongst themselves to take over the entire island. Led by King June, who was the king when they was captured, the first person they planned to kill was a slave owner who was friends with the governor who issued out those laws And they did that to send a message to let them know they were coming for their freedom. Well, as they killed the governor's friend, a group of other slaves were making routine deliveries of firewood to the fort, but they armed themselves with machetes that they used to cut sugarcane with. And they hid their weapons when they went to make this delivery, and they caught the Danish soldiers off guard, and according to the record, they killed all of them except one. And then they raided the fort and got all the weapons and ammunition they needed and whatever supplies they could find. Then after they armed themselves, they fired one of their cannons. So, every time this cannon is fired, the Danish use it as a warning, and they usually gather in case of an emergency. But the Akwamu knew it, and this time they used it against them to ambush them. And when they came to the meeting place, they killed as many of them as they could. Now, it's clear the Akwamu were skilled warriors, and they killed a lot of people and took the land. And they even had women involved in their movement. And one group was led by a woman named Brefa. And I'm sorry if I got that name wrong. But this sister fought to get her children that was taken back, according to the story. Now, this rebellion led by only one tribe, the Akwamu tribe, was able to make all of the Europeans flee from the island and essentially turn themselves into an independent black country. Now, the problem for the Akwamu is they made a lot of enemies with black people. They were involved in selling a lot of people who were on the island who was not supporting their revolution anyway. They only wanted their people in the rebellion because they wanted to enslave other black people, right? They just wanted to be the ones in control. They felt that they weren't the slaves, but they felt they were better than other black people. But it made it harder for them because they made so many enemies with other black people. Now, the Danish eventually joined forces with the French and Swiss armies. So the Akwamu realized they had to include other black people in their rebellion. And they tried to make a deal and offer money and freedom to anybody who was willing to help join them on the front lines. But of course, they didn't get a lot of support from other black people. But even with that, initially, the three European countries working together, the Danish, the French, and the Swiss, still couldn't beat the Akwamu, and they couldn't retake the land, even though they had more weapons. The Akwamu stayed in power on the island for about 10 months. And if they didn't make enemies with other black people, who knows how long it would have lasted. Maybe forever. But eventually, it was too many European countries working together, too many soldiers, and too many weapons, and they eventually overpowered them. Now, some people escaped into the swamp and the woods, but everybody who was captured was killed. Most of them was beheaded, some of them was hanged, some of them was burnt at the stake. Some was just tortured until they died. Now, they did find a lot of people, but most of them chose to commit suicide before they were captured and tortured or re-enslaved or anything. And when they got cornered, they just killed themselves. Or again, in the words of Killmonger, death is better than bondage for them. Now, this rebellion lasted from 1733 to 1734, but it was eventually ended and things became even more harsh. But anytime a revolt happens, especially when a lot of white people get killed, the news is going to spread to European colonies throughout the world. And that news is going to spread along with white fear. So in 1735, South Carolina passed a law requiring free Negroes to leave the colony. Now, in 1733, Georgia was founded, and initially it was a free colony. But, the founder of Georgia wasn't trying to ban slavery for moral reasons, right? It was for political reasons and for other strategic reasons. Now, in the last lesson, I mentioned how Spanish Florida started offering Negroes freedom in exchange for converting to Catholicism and for joining their army. And the British knew that bringing slaves to Georgia closer to Florida was only going to start more problems and just start increasing runaways. But by this time, as word spread about Spanish Florida, many enslaved people tried to escape south before they tried to escape north, as you usually hear. The first place before Canada was Florida. And with more enslaved people helping the Spanish army, it could cause trouble for the British. And by 1738, the first black settlement in Florida was established, called Fort Mose.
In the late 1600s, rival imperial powers, Spain and England, shared a border near what became South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Any slave who escaped to Florida from the British colonies was granted their freedom. For the enslaved, Spanish Florida became the first promised land. In 1738, a small group of black people created their own town near St. Augustine. They called it Fort Mose, the first all-black settlement in what is now the United States.
Enslaved folk in South Carolina realized that if they reach Florida, that is not controlled by the English, perhaps they can seek refuge.
300 miles north of Fort Mose, near the Stono River just outside of Charleston, word of the free town to the south reached a group of slaves. This inspired one of the largest slave revolts in the history of the British colonies. One morning in 1739, a group of about 20 black men set out before dawn. As they traveled, they set fire to plantations. Nearly 100 slaves joined them for the journey. When word of the fugitives' rebellion spread, local militiamen were mobilized, and a brutal battle ensued. Many were killed in the clash, and black rebels who were later captured were tried and beheaded in an effort to instill fear. To discourage future rebellions, harsh new slave laws were imposed, including forbidding teaching slaves to read. Within a year, British colonial forces seized Florida from Spain, and Fort Mose was destroyed.
Now, even though Georgia did ban slavery, those who were in charge still allowed slaves to be imported into the colony. But South Carolina was more worried, and in 1739 they passed the Security Act, which required every white dude to have their guns on them 7 days a week, including while they were at church. Now, I keep mentioning about how Sundays was a big day for rebellions, and one of the Europeans' biggest fears was a rebellion on a Sunday while everybody was in church. And you know what happened? On a Sunday in September 1739, their worst nightmare came true with the Stono Rebellion.
Poisoning could not be caught readily, and it was often something that was feared by whites even when it didn't exist.
One symptom of their fear was that there was a law that white men had to carry guns when they went to church. Sunday was the only day off for enslaved people. And so the white folks feared that the uprising, if it ever came, would happen on Sunday when all the whites were gathered in church. Therefore, the white men were required to carry their guns to church.
It was on a Saturday night, September 1739. It was a work crew. Many of them are Angolans, including a man named Jemmy, who becomes the leader.
The fated Sunday finally came on the Stono River, southwest of Charleston. And they got to a store and broke in, and they killed a Mr. Hutchinson, decapitated him and put his head on a pole and cleared out his store of guns.
It happens in harvest time, which is the time when blacks are being worked the hardest. It also happens in malaria time, and there is an epidemic going on in Charleston, which has virtually shut down the town.
They did recognize the possibility that if they took common action as soldiers, they might be able to escape.
The governor of Florida had already issued a decree that any African who was a slave who made it to Florida would be free, and there was indeed a colony there of ex-slaves.
There is this African manned fortification, and when the Stono Rebellion breaks out, it becomes clear that what these people are trying to do is to reach Fort Mose.
People begin to join them. They burn successive plantations, kill some of the white people living there, draw some of the blacks with them. Others are afraid to join in and refuse to go. But unfortunately for them, they meet the lieutenant governor riding north.
They gave chase to him, but he was able to sound the alarm, and then, of course, a sort of a posse is formed, and they set out after this group of Africans.
It's an amazing moment. If they had been able to take him hostage, who knows what the dynamics would have been. These people are pursued south for a day or two. If they had been able to go another 24 or 48 hours so that more people could have joined them, their strength would have been greater, and who knows what the prospects would have been.
And the whites came on them. They surrounded these men and they fired on them. A lot of them were scattered. Many of them were killed.
Some of them escaped into the swamp, but those that they did capture, they chopped their heads off and put their heads on poles leading out down what is today US 17 out of Charleston to send a message to the other Africans. This is what will happen to you if you rebel.
After the Stono Rebellion, all of the separate laws governing slavery were consolidated into a single code. This Black Code restricted the movement of black people and regulated almost every aspect of the lives of the enslaved.
Now, during the harvest time in the fall, of course, slaves were worked even harder so that they can get as much produce as they could. And they worked them longer hours, and they also treated them much harsher. So a slave named Jimmy from Angola, according to the record, organized a group of men by the Stono River to plan their rebellion. So they waited until a Sunday when all of the white people were in church, and they broke into an ammunition store and killed the store owner. I believe they ended up decapitating him, and then they armed themselves. Now they marched through the town with drums, letting people know it was time, chanting liberty, and they killed a few slave owners and overseers and was able to free others. Now this is one of the reasons why the drum was banned, because sometimes it was a message that it was wartime. But they also banned it to stop communication too, so. But they ended up killing about 25 white people and beheaded some of them. And they were able to free about 30 or 40 people, and their numbers grew to around 50 or 60. Now, they were only about 30 miles from Fort Mose and reaching Florida when they came across this white boy, but they couldn't catch him, and he was able to alert another posse. And a mob of armed white boys showed up. Now, unfortunately for these enslaved brothers, it was just too many of the white boys and they had too many weapons, and they lost the battle. Some managed to escape into the swamp, into the woods, but most of them were captured. Now, a few of them were deported to Jamaica to get quote-unquote broken or to receive discipline. And we're going to talk about the British colony of Jamaica and this quote-unquote breaking process and how a lot of slaves were sent there to be quote-unquote broken, especially the rebellious ones. But we'll get to that later. But most of them, including Jimmy and the other leaders who were captured, they were killed. And most of them were decapitated, and then they put their head on a stick along the highway US 17 in Charleston just to send a message. And I'm sure some of you ride by US 17 in Charleston, but they had that brother's head sitting on the side of the road out there. Now, after the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina ended up passing the Negro Act of 1740.
On this date in 1740, South Carolina passes the Negro Act of 1740, which allows masters to whip and kill slaves who violate the law by growing their own food, learning to read, assembling in groups, or earning money.
September 20th, 1739. As a result of the rebellion, slaves that had previously escaped were captured and executed or sold. The white community knew that they had to keep a better eye on their slaves to prevent this from happening again. More slaves codes were enforced that made punishment for runaway slaves more severe, but also required owners to treat their slaves a little better to prevent them from wanting to rebel again. Owners also knew that they couldn't always keep an eye on the slaves every waking second, so they allowed certain slaves to become informants within the slave community, and the Security Act was being passed that required all whites to carry guns with them on Sundays in case slaves wanted to attack on their day off. The white owners also made an example of slaves who didn't join or fought against the rebellion by rewarding them with clothes and money. The slave of a man named Thomas Eliot was actually awarded his freedom for defending his owner and his owner's family from the rebels.
Now, the first thing this Negro Act did was increase security with the importation of slaves in the colony, because they wanted to make sure they wasn't sending in any more rebellious slaves. So they got real strict about it. But the law also reinforced other laws that prohibited slaves' ability to earn money, to gather in groups, or to walk around alone. So you couldn't walk around in a group or walk around by yourself. They also made it illegal for slaves to be able to grow their own food. And the law of 1740 was also one of the first laws against education, and they made it illegal to teach slaves how to read or write. And I'm telling you right now, one thing that they hate is an educated black person, especially an educated black person who can encourage unity and actually make it happen. But, they stopped slaves from being able to read and write. Now, of course, they reinforced laws that allow slave owners to kill anybody they thought was rebellious. But now South Carolina required one white dude to be heavily armed for every 10 slaves on a plantation. So if you have 20 slaves on one plantation, then there has to be 2 white boys who are heavily armed. Now, the thing is, South Carolina also started a Christian school so they can force their religious doctrine onto slaves. And even though they just said that slaves couldn't read and write, guess what the one thing they allowed slaves to read and write? That slave Bible. And even then, most of the slaves could not read it. But the only thing that Negroes could read was that good old slave Bible, for whatever that's worth. Now, as for the French and their colonies, including Louisiana, their king, Louis XV, said any child born to an enslaved woman and free man couldn't be sold away. And after a certain time, that child would be granted freedom. Now, even though this law was meant to discourage slave owners from impregnating women and selling their own children away, I think it had a great impact on a woman's decision on who to have children with. Because, of course, if the father was free, her child wouldn't be sold and eventually could earn freedom. Now, I'm not sure if they were including black men in that equation, but, I think it played a role in women's decision about who to have children with. And, in my opinion, I think it led to that whole mulatto, octoroon, biracial system, and that whole thing that they had going on in New Orleans and Louisiana. And we're going to touch on that, because there was a whole system with octoroon and mulatto women. But we're going to touch on that in another lesson. But I don't want to go too far in this lesson or make it too long or put too much information in a small space. But there is one more thing that I want to mention before I end it. Because, speaking of South Carolina, a lot of people don't realize that at this time, around 1740, New York had the second most amount of slaves of all the colonies, only behind South Carolina. And of course, we talked about who was running New York with the Dutch and a lot of them being Jewish merchants. And you know what? Whites in New York feared a rebellion just as much as they did in South Carolina, which ended up leading to the New York Conspiracy of 1741.
In 1741, New York had the second largest slave population in the 13 colonies. Poor whites weren't a fan of this as they had more competition for work. Tensions were increased by the extreme winter chill of 1740 and 1741. For a few months beginning March 18th, over a dozen fires raged across Manhattan. As many buildings were flammable, initially the fires were seen as accidental until more happened. Many residents remembered the slave revolt of 1712, in which over 20 slaves organized and destroyed property. One named Kofi set fire to his master's property, inciting a riot in which 9 whites were killed and 6 injured. 21 slaves were executed as a result. Remembering this in 1741, the city council started an investigation, putting a man named Daniel Horsemanden in charge. His prime suspect was a white tavern owner named John Hewson, who pissed locals off because he allowed slaves, free blacks, and poor whites to congregate in his place. Wealthy whites didn't like the idea of these oppressed groups mingling together. A fire on April 6 fueled the belief that slaves or free blacks were behind the arsons, as when a black man was spotted running away from it, someone blamed him and a crowd claimed, "The Negroes are rising." Horsemanden urged an indentured servant named Mary Burton, who worked for John Hewson, to spill the tea, and she claimed it was a conspiracy between poor whites and blacks, saying they regularly met at the tavern. She was promised 100 pounds for her cooperation. Hundreds of slaves and free blacks were arrested on suspicion, and 2 slaves named Cuffy and Quack were convicted and condemned to hang in May, despite alibis from their wealthy white masters, which was a pretty big deal. Days before being set to hang, they identified dozens of people they claimed to be co-conspirators. From May 11th to August 29th, 17 blacks and 4 whites were convicted and hanged. 13 blacks were burned alive, and over 70 more were exiled from the city. This included Spanish blacks and white Catholics, who were predominantly seen as enemies because the 13 colonies' mother country, Britain, was at war with Catholic Spain at the time. Mary Burton continued naming names as a witness, but when she and others began accusing wealthy whites of participating in the conspiracy, she was released as a witness and the investigation promptly ended. Historians disagree about many things in this story, including whether or not the conspiracy was real. What do you think?
Now, during the winter of 1741, several fires broke out in the city. And even though it was probably because of poor buildings made by wood and all kind of fire code violations and flammable stuff everywhere, but you know, the first thing they have to do is blame it on the Negro. So after they had a meeting in court, they ended up blaming 3 enslaved men, Prince, Cuffy, and Caesar, without any evidence. Now, the one witness they had was a 16-year-old white Irish girl named Mary Burton, who worked at a bar where slaves and free black people could go there and visit. And people were already mad about this spot because, you know, slaves and free black people was gathering in a location, which happened to be a bar, and she could serve them drinks. Now, this white girl told the authorities about how she worked in the bar and how she sold Negroes alcohol, which was illegal, along with gathering in groups of more than 3. But this white girl claimed she heard Negroes and poor whites planning to burn the city, and she said they planned to kill white males and take their women. Now, she was likely lying because why would enslaved black people or free black people plan to kill all whites and take their wives with other white people? And there were a lot of holes in her story. But you know what? It was enough to convict Caesar and Prince. Now, in exchange for her story, this white girl ended up getting freed from her indenture. And by the way, you know how they like to be like Irish were slaves too? Really, were indentured servants. They were like this 16-year-old white girl who was running a bar for her quote-unquote owner, the person who owned her indenture. Nothing even close to what slavery was, especially during this time. But in exchange for this Irish white girl testimony, she got free from her indenture and was paid money. Now, even Prince and Caesar's owners, who were wealthy, vouched for them, but they were still burned at the stake on the word of this 16-year-old white girl. And she made so many accusations that close to 200 people were arrested. Now, this may be the first white girl on record lying and getting innocent people killed, but maybe not, because there is a long history of it. But this is one of the first recorded instances, maybe, I'm not sure. But based off this one white girl, at least 30 black people were hung or burned at the stake. And at least 70 more was deported to Barbados. Now keep in mind, they still haven't figured out how any of these fires started, if anybody actually did it. They're just going off the word of this little white girl. Now, they did punish a few poor white people, but I think most of the white people they punished was just banned from New York. But if you want to hear about what happened to them, take a European American course. But anyway, now this white girl was just naming names, right? They done arrested people. They done killed 30 black people, shipped 70 off to Barbados. But once she started naming wealthy white people, all of a sudden the investigation was over and they let her go as a witness. And so, they just moved on like nothing happened. And I guess this white girl got her freedom, quote unquote. But it did cause so much paranoia and white fear. And like I said, that news about rebellion spread. And after the conspiracy, Virginia made it a felony for slaves to conspire or gather together, which was punishable by death. If any slave was caught walking around at night, they were going to be dismembered. And if they died, of course, there was no punishment. Now, before we get too far, we're going to end this lesson right here. But even with this lesson, there's a lot to learn within the lesson, right? And it's hard to touch on every single point. But we can see how unity has helped us, have benefited us, but also how disunity or not being unified has come back to bite us. Like we saw with the Akwamu tribe. Maybe if they didn't think they were better than other black people and worked together, they would have been able to maintain their freedom. And a lesson that we still keep learning over and over and over. They thought that Europeans were there to be their friends when they were there to make slaves. And they had no loyalty to them. So even if you do business with them and you think that you're friends, it ended up leading to the Akwamu tribe being sold into slavery, especially creating enemies within. Because we also saw how working together will give you the best chance, especially when you're able to use their tribal differences against them and exploit them to give you a better chance at freedom, right? And then maybe you can have more black colonies that are able to last and sustain themselves. And of course, we talked about how we fought from day one, and we're continuing to see them fight. They fought on slave ships. I know some people don't believe in it, but for there to be slave ship rebellions, there has to be slave ships, right? So you may want to get out of your, bias because, like I said, most people went to the Caribbean, right, to South America, and people were transported from here to the Caribbean and South America. Before we put any of our bias or any of our opinions, let's just look at the evidence that we have, what's out there. Because next week, we're going to pick it up there, especially with the rebellions going on in the Caribbean and places like Jamaica, and even how they're linked to here in America. And we're going to talk about Jamaica a little bit more and why slaves were sent to places like that to get quote unquote broken. And, I think that's important. And we also going to touch on one of y'all favorite topics, which is those good old white abolitionists, those good old white folks y'all love so much. Now we're going to look and see how good these good white folks, these good white abolitionists really were. And we're going to see if they really loved y'all as much as y'all really hope they do. But we are also close to, the beginning of what is America and their quote unquote revolution. So we might touch on the beginning of that if we have time next week. We'll start to see some more familiar names that is used a lot more in the modern times. So hopefully I'll see everybody here next week and it'll be a great discussion. Now, if you have any questions about anything that we talked about in this lesson, feel free to ask. And I want to thank everybody for showing me so much love and appreciation. These things is hard to do, and y'all support keep me going. So thank y'all, and I appreciate that. And hopefully more people will start to come up with a course of their own. It could be anything that you are good at. Astrophysics, if that's what you want to do. Geometry, geography, calculus, chemistry, finance, budgeting. It doesn't matter. Cooking. It doesn't matter. Come up with a course, but keep that black mindset within that course, right? And we're going to build on the future. So thank everybody. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.